Now, what we're going to do is come to Titus Chapter 2. Now, remember, the theme here is our common Christian life, that the book of Titus. And as we think about that, about this study, we're going to look at two verses. This morning we dealt with the ladies, very kind. You were very kind. Nobody threw anything this morning. You looked like you were paying attention, and I thank you very much for that. But Titus chapter 2 and verses 9 and 10, if you would. Exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters and to please them well in all things, not answering again, not prolonging, but showing all good fidelity, that they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior in all things. Father, guide us tonight. Help us to think through how we do our work as you guide and lead us. In Jesus' name, amen. Brother Glock gave me a very nice article that he wrote about servants and bondservants. And it's interesting, in his article, he makes this observation that with just few exceptions, the Greek word for this servant is used in the New Testament to give instructions to Christians about serving God and fulfilling his will for their life. This word, servant, is very important. It does not mean employee, like we would think of it, but actually someone who is owned by somebody else. Now, I want you to think, if you would, please, first of all, I want you to think of the objective here, the objective of our study. And let's see, is this on? Yep. Is it on? Pardon? Okay, advance one slide for me, see if that works. Okay. Might need some help there. Oh. There you go. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. So, objective. Okay. Look at the last phrase. Okay, of verse 10. Okay. It says, last phrase of verse 10, that they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior in all things. You see, we work to adorn the doctrine of God. That when we perform our obligations correctly, we bring people's attention to God. We draw people to it. We draw people to it, and we put things in order. The word adorn means to put things in the right place. And like when a woman adorns herself in proper attire, she puts everything in the right place for the best possible result. And the idea here is that we adorn the doctrine of God. We project it to the world around us when we work at work like we're supposed to. Now, when we think about work, I want to encourage you not to limit yourself to thinking a 9-to-5 job or where you go on Monday morning, because some of you don't go anywhere but Monday morning, but to the living room, okay, or to the kitchen to start with, because you don't go anywhere. So what does it mean about you? It means you, like all the rest of us, have responsibilities to fulfill your obligations on a daily basis in a proper fashion. But we are thinking primarily here about the work situation, but we all have obligations that we need to focus on. With that said, let me give you 3 starting points, okay? Hold your place. We'll be back here in a moment. And turn to Colossians chapter 3, if you would, okay? Turn to Colossians chapter, just to your left a bit. Colossians chapter 3, okay? And I want to read one particular verse right now. We'll read 2. We'll begin verse 22. Servants, obey in all things, Colossians 3:22, your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. And whatsoever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men. So first of all, 3 things to start with. First of all, we work for God. That when we work for God, we're doing it for the Lord. And if you think about that, that changes our whole approach. I don't go into the office and do what my supervisor demands of me or what my responsibility. Remember this, everybody works for somebody. Everybody works for somebody. You say, well, I wish I was the boss. Well, the boss works for everybody else and everything else, okay? The owner of the company. He works for all of his clients or her clients, because if the clients don't show up, you don't have any business. So the idea that I wish I was higher up in management, just remember this, the higher up you go, the more responsibility you have, okay? And if you're the one where everything stops with you, then that's even a greater responsibility. But we work for God. Now think how that changes things. I often wonder why. You know people that get up on Monday morning and they go to work and you see them at a convenience store getting coffee or whatever, and they talk about Monday. Is it usually in a positive way or a negative way? Which way? Negative, okay? Zig Ziglar used to have the saying that he would not call it an alarm clock. He would call it, do you remember what he used to call it? The what? Opportunity clock. Not an alarm clock. Alarm is like, oh, there's a problem. It's actually an opportunity clock, okay? And so it's an interesting way of looking at it, just a turn of words there, but also a turn of ideas. The fact that when I'm going to work, whatever my work is, if it's doing dishes, if it's like I know at our house we have a dishwasher, and when I open it up and the dishes are clean, I think to myself, isn't it a wonderful thing? I get to put the dishes up myself. I get to put them all up myself. Isn't that one exciting thing? I can do that. You say, you don't really believe that, do you, preacher? Well, not always, but I tell myself that because it actually is a blessing to be able to serve. If you don't think it's a blessing to work, then go over to any rest home you want to go to where people are not physically able to move around and people love to work. It's a blessing. But we work unto the Lord. Now, I want to encourage you about that. Next time you start cocking an attitude about having to go to work, remember, it is a gift, a work unto God. Second, we work to meet our needs. Let me give you a couple of references here. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10. For even when you were with you, this we commanded you, that if any man would not work, he should not eat. So we do that to meet our needs. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8 says, but if any provide not for his own, especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So why do we work? Well, first of all, we work for God. But second, we work to meet our needs. That's a proper thing to do. All right? And so some people have to work more than one job. I was talking to somebody the other day who lived in the area, has a pretty nice job in the area, but they had to have a second job. And that sometimes happens, okay? You have to do other things, and that's a responsibility you have to make. Now, the third observation is this. We work to help others. We work to help others. Acts chapter 20, okay, and verse 35. Acts 20, verse 35 says this, I have shown you all things, that so laboring ye ought to support the weak. And remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he said it is more blessed to give than to receive. So why do I work? I work because when I do my work, whatever it is, whether it's at home or on the job, in the school, wherever it is, I do it. I think, is it echoing in here? It's not echoing? A bit, maybe it's down just a bit, but thank you. We work for God. Second, we work to meet the needs of others, meet our own needs, and then we work to help other people. Now, if you don't have the right motive, you're going to start creating really negative attitudes about it. Now, let me ask you a question. Have you ever worked someplace where it wasn't fair? They weren't fair to you? How do you respond when life's not fair to you? How do you respond when the environment, one of the jobs I had a number of jobs in Bible college. One of the jobs I worked at was an auto parts warehouse. And the fellow that was in charge, that ran the place, was the owner's son-in-law, which should tell you something. Now, that's how he got the job. He said, okay. And he would call us into the office, and he would complain. We had to go around and pull orders for the different auto parts stores in the region. And we'd pull orders, and there'd be mistakes made, okay, in the ordering. And he would say, now listen, I know if you're not making mistakes, you're not working. But don't make any mistakes. That was the counsel. And that was so frustrating. He didn't give us any tips. No, well, maybe try this. Maybe this might help you, or whatever. It just says, if you work, you're going to make mistakes. I understand that, but don't make any mistakes. And that was a bit frustrating, okay? Sometimes you have people that are just not very helpful to you at all, and they put responsibilities on you that create sometimes some real challenge. So from these two verses, though, back in our text, I want to give you three things to write down. Very simple message tonight. Three things to write down, and then we'll go from there, okay? Let's look at the verses again. I exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters and to please them well in all things, not answering again. And here's the first one. I am called as a Christian to do our best. And there are four words to put up there, okay? The word acceptance, the word sacrifice, the word personal, and the word pleasing. We're going to talk about all four of these concepts from this first part of the verse, okay? First of all, it says, exhort servants. Now, there's an element of acceptance there, of two things: accepting what I have and accepting what I don't have. Remember this: accepting what I have and what I don't have. This word servant here is not like, well, I decided to go from Dairy Queen to McDonald's, or from Wendy's to Burger King, deciding where to go work. This word servant is that bond servant, which is somebody that is completely owned. And the majority of the people around the Mediterranean in this first century were in some kind of slave bondage, okay? And the master could do whatever he or she wanted to do with their piece of property. Now, many of them were given great latitude, that's true, but many of them were ill-treated and they suffered for it, right? But what Paul is telling them is to accept the place where God has placed you. Now, if you're a slave in the first century, you don't have any other options. It's not like, well, which master do you want to apply to? You are owned by them. In our situation, we have a different dynamic. You can choose who you're going to work for, okay? Or you choose who you want to work for, or try to work for, okay? So you can make changes. But there has to be an element of accepting what God has given you and not being consumed with what you don't have. And guarantee you, tomorrow morning when you go into work, okay, after you have your hour of prayer tomorrow morning and you go into work tomorrow, if you start thinking of everything you don't have on the job, everything you don't like about your job, everything you wish you was like someplace else on your job, by lunchtime you'd be ready to give it up, okay? But I will tell you, if you focus on it in a different position, different perspective, say, Lord, this is the job you have given me. This is your calling upon my life. Do you realize this? Since we picked on Chris earlier about the concrete stuff, okay? So I have laid concrete one time in my life. I helped a guy in Bible college. He needed a pair of hands, so I helped him lay concrete, and it was successful, okay? But that's not my calling tomorrow. But if God's calling in your life tomorrow is to teach a class, or to lay concrete, or to be at home doing your obligations at home, there needs to be an acceptance of where you are right now. Acceptance of this is the gift of God to your life. This is God's sovereign calling. You do realize if I come to the office tomorrow and I spend time preparing for Wednesday night and next Sunday and praying and trying to lead the church as pastor, that's not more important than what God's calling upon your life. It's just a different calling. Now, what I do is important, but what you do is also important, whatever it may be. And I want to encourage you to do your best with the spirit of accepting this is God's will. Now, there are a couple of challenges you have to face, because sometimes people, when they're younger, they're always discontent and always trying to find the magic place to, whereas for most people, if they just were maybe more settled. Now, God does sometimes move you. I understand that. So if you're in the process of moving from one company to another, or one work to another, that happens. But you have to be careful that you never move. Watch this. Out of a spirit of unacceptance. In other words, I'm not accepting God's will here, so I'm choosing this over here. If God leads me from here to here, that's fine. But I always have the spirit of accepting what I have and not being consumed with what I don't have. But the second is the idea of sacrifice. Look at it says, those servants to be obedient. And the word obedient there means to submit or place into subjection. So when I go to work, I do what? I'm supposed to work. I'm supposed to give myself to the task at hand, whatever it may be. I sacrifice within the bounds of propriety to make it happen. Now, one of the things we have to be careful about, particularly in our culture, is this. Workplace has really moved into the home place, hasn't it? In what way has the workplace moved into the home place? What's the most dramatic way in which that's happened? The computer and cell phone, which is the portable computer nowadays, right? The cell phone, all right? And so you have to be careful when it comes to sacrificing. I hear this a lot from people. Over the years, I've heard people do this. They have sacrificed for a company and gone beyond the call of duty for years and years and years, and then something happens, and they don't get a raise, don't get a promotion, and they start cocking. Look at all the stuff I've done above the call of duty. Okay, well, okay, that was your choice. Okay? You know, part of the fact is you got to make a decision. And when you make your sacrifices, they have to be in the right lane. There are limits to the sacrifices that you're called to make. The limit is the will of God. So, for example, if I'm over here, working here, and doing this work here at the job, and I have a family over here, I can't neglect this or this area for this area. But I cannot neglect this for that area or I'll be unemployed, right? So you have to balance it out. And I just want to encourage you. Remember this, you might want to write this down. People will treat you, normally, people will treat you the way you let them treat you. They will treat you the way you let them treat you or the way that you accept being treated, right? If you don't accept it, then it may mean get another job. It may be. Maybe that's what God's will for your life is. But you have to know what your responsibilities are. That's like I know in our family, for example, when I come home, we don't have very many normal weeks, but a normal day, if I'm coming home and in the afternoon and we're having dinner and then we're going to be home in the evening, it's a Monday night or a Tuesday or a Thursday or a Friday night, whatever, and we're just home for the night, okay? Whatever we're going to do, put up Christmas decorations or, whatever we're going to do. Okay, so, all right, so what often I will do is I will cut my cell phone off. And whenever I cut it on, I find that the world has not stopped functioning. The world has not ended, okay? And of course, people always say to me, well, what about an emergency? To which I always respond, that's why God created 911. If it's an emergency, they can call 911. If not, you deal with it when you get back. You do realize there was a time, for millennium, people survived without being on call 24/7. You say, well, they might go someplace else. Probably not in this environment they won't, but even if they do, okay, you have to make sure you're taking care of your home place. When I first got out of Bible college, I struggled with that. I didn't know. How do you balance out? When do you come to the point during the week where you say, I've prayed all you need to pray, I've visited all I need to visit, I've studied all I need to study? I mean, when do you reach the limit? There is no limit. So I really struggled in the early years to know how to balance it out. But when I finally got a hold of it, not that I'm not like I got it all figured out. I mean, it's because it's a constant challenge. But it's a constant challenge. But there is a concept of balancing that you have to work out. So, but there is a call to sacrifice. It's also it's a sacrifice call. But also, there's a personal element of it. Look at it says, if you would please, in the verse, unto their own masters. Unto their own is one word. It talks about the idea of ownership, of being personal, of belonging. I want to encourage you, when you think about doing your best, that you have to have a personal buy-in. You might change personal to buy-in, but however you want to do it. But the idea of personally buying into, this is my responsibility. Now, again, not out of boundaries of all your other obligations, but having that personal focus to say, this is my responsibility. And then notice what it says, and to pleasing them well in all things. The word pleasing there means doing what's acceptable, okay? So here's the deal. Who decides what's acceptable when you work for somebody? The people you're working for, right? They decide what's acceptable. Now, what do you decide in that equation? Well, what's not acceptable and what you will accept to stay, keep working there, right? And so, in other words, so if they say to you, hey, in order to have this job, you have to do X, Y, and Z, but Y and Z is something that's outside the call of God upon your life, and you can't take that job. You just don't do it, okay? And you have to be very clear about that. But the idea is to please those who you're responsible to. If you own a company and you're in retail, who are you trying to please? Your customers. Or if you own the business, whoever your business does business with. Okay? You're trying to please them. So the idea of doing your best involves the idea of acceptance, of sacrifice, of making it personal, and also seeking to please them. Now, with that in mind, I want you to turn to one reference. Turn to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. And I want you to put it in perspective. I came across this verse years ago, and somebody shared it with me at a time we were doing some work in a yard for somebody, and they shared this verse, one of these verses with me. It really helped me in some respects in my life. But look at Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 5. Ephesians 6, verse 5. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and singleness of heart, okay? Not with eye service, again, as men pleasers. We talked about that before in Colossians. But as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will, doing service as to the Lord and not to men. Knowing that whatsoever good thing to watch is a man doeth, the same shall receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. I want you to understand that when you work, you're going to be blessed by God and rewarded of God in your faithfulness, because your faithful performance at work is a faithful service unto God. So when you go in tomorrow, if you go in tomorrow, and you have these responsibilities as you do them to the Lord, as you accept, as you sacrifice, as you make it personal, you buy into it, you seek to please, you are serving God, and God's going to bless you and reward us of our faithfulness. That's part of the reward we'll receive in heaven for being faithful. Not just faithful at church, that's part of it, but faithful at work, okay? And faithful to our family. I want to encourage you, okay? Write this down, please. The Christian work ethic does not begin when you go to work. The Christian work ethic begins at midnight every day and ends at the midnight of the next day. It is a Christian has to have a whole life view of work. Because I have to work. Remember the saying I've given you many times? Men don't come home from work. They come home why? To work. They don't come home from work. Well, I've done my job. No. You come home not from work, but to work. Okay? And so it's all inclusive. And I just want to encourage you to seek to do your best at your place of employment, at your home, in the church, and all these principles controlling it. Number two, not only do we need to do our best, but second, we need to control our speech. Wow. Really? Have you ever heard people at work saying negative things about the boss? Have you? Complaining things about the company. Have you ever been to a retail store where the person's checking you out or working at the store and they're complaining about the company they work for? Have you ever seen that? Do you like that? I don't. I really don't. I said, well, don't you care? Not really. Because, not at that moment I don't care. I'm there spending my hard-earned money for the company, and you're supposed to be helping me do my thing, okay? So if you don't like the company, then quit. Okay? I don't know what you do. If that's not God's will for your life, then quit it. Okay? But you have to guard your tongue. The phrase in verse D, the last part of verse 9, it says, and in all things not answering again. And that Greek word means speaking in oppositions, contradicting, or resisting. If there's grumbling at the office, if there's grumbling in the school, if there's a grumbling in the class, it should not come from you as a Christian. Right? Remember when the kids would come home, our young kids would come home from school, if they ever started talking about the teacher, okay, and speaking ill of her or him, we would nip it in the bud. You can't talk to them about them like that way. Okay? They're the teacher God has given you. Now I want to give you three things to write down. And we're going to look at three different references to give them to you. Turn, if you would, please. It's what we talked about this morning, but I'm going to give it to you again. First of all, when you do your speech, you need to be guided by what is helpful. Let's go to Ephesians We saw it this morning, but let's see it one more time in this context. Ephesians chapter 4. Chapter 4, okay? Let's turn to Ephesians, a verse we talked about this morning. I realize that, but I think it's worth looking at one more time to get our minds in this right direction. I want to encourage, and I want you to see the context of this, okay? Look at we'll begin in verse 25 this evening. Verse 25, Ephesians 4 and verse 25. I have to ask myself what is helpful at work. That should govern what I say. Verse 25, wherefore put away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Be angry and sin not, let not the sun go down upon your wrath. Neither give place to the devil. Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the things that are good, that he may have to give to him that needeth. Now notice in verses 25 to 28, notice the context of him talking about being truthful, by being honest, by being righteous, and how we deal with anger and all of that. And if you do that properly, look at verse 29, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying. You see, when I decide what I'm going to say at work, it has to be that which is helpful to the folks around us. You are not helping those you work for or work with. When you're talking negatively and you're complaining and you're being unacceptable. Second of all, let me give you two references to write down for the second one. The second one is, in fact, what God approves. What God approves. And in Psalm chapter 141, verse 3. Psalm 141, verse 3 said, a watch, O Lord, before my mouth, and keep the door of my lips. I say what God approves. Psalm 19 and verse 14. Psalm 19, verse 14. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Psalm 19, verse 14. So when I'm going to control my tongue at work and not speak in opposition, I have to limit what I say to what is helpful. Second, to what God approves, the words I say. But the third one is this, okay? And I need to dwell on this just for a moment. What is appropriate? There is an appropriate limit to right speech. In other words, what you say or want to say may be the truth. What you want to say may need to be said at some level, but you're not the one to say it. There's a limit. Take your Bibles and turn to Acts 23, okay, the book of Acts. Look at Acts and chapter 23. And notice, if you would, a particular illustration here about Paul and the use of the tongue. Not in the workplace, he's being interrogated, but still what he says is applicable to what we're talking about this evening. Chapter 23, verse 1. And Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. Now he's being interrogated, he's being pressured, persecuted. Verse 2, and the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by to smite him on the mouth. Then said Paul, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall, for sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commendest me to be smitten contrary to the law. Now the white wall there would refer to the walls they would paint white, where they had people buried, okay, and they would cover it with whitewash, and of course behind it was wickedness and decay, for appearance sake. Now he's calling this. Now why is he calling him a whited wall? What is he accusing the high priest of doing? Being a hypocrite. He's saying that he's opposing Paul because of the Old Testament law, but he's violating it, okay? Look at verse 4. And they stood by and said, revilest thou God's high priest? This man has a position. He said, well, what he said was true. Doesn't matter. It does matter. When you're speaking to somebody in position of responsibility, it matters what you say. All right. Now look at verse 5. Then said Paul, I wish not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. He's acknowledging that he was wrong in saying it about the leader, okay? Now, let's just talk about this for a second. You got to be very careful, okay, at work when you're speaking to other people. By the way, today, it's not just what you say at work. What else is it? Social media, right? They watch what you post. It's once you say it, there's no such thing as private communication. You have to assume anybody you're talking to at work, somebody might be taping you. The folks in California learned that on the city council recently, okay, in California. You never know who's recording something, okay? But besides that, the main reason is you want to do what's right. But you have to be careful what you say and what you post. You know, God has to lead you. You say, well, I'm going to say it because it's right. That's fine. But when you're talking about specific people that are in leadership in your life, there needs to be a level of respect, of acknowledgement of their position. Here, Paul said, you know what? I shouldn't say this because, I should have said that because you are the ruler of the people, and it's wrong for me to say that. So he acknowledged he was wrong. I want to encourage you to guard what you say and ask yourself, is it appropriate that I say it? Just because it's right, it doesn't mean you're supposed to say it. Even though it needs to be said, doesn't mean that you need to be said to say it. I will tell you this, many times when you're talking to authority, it's more how you say it, not always, than what you say. I remember when I mentioned this before, I think, but when I was in Bible college, the first year we were in Bible college, Karen and I were in the dorms. Now, we went to school in an era, the school system was completely different than what we had chaperones for our dates. I mean, this was a different world. Okay, but anyhow, so we had to be in the dorms by 11 o'clock. So I was in the dorm at 11 o'clock, and there was a dorm, L-shaped building. We had one phone for the whole floor. This is like really olden days, almost right after they got past the smoke signals, okay? And there was a phone at the corner. And so the phone rings, and now I want to say, and they would come knock on the door. You go down, you get your phone. If I get a phone call, I go down the corner, and it's Karen. And she says, I said, hey, babe. Oh, I don't know what I said. I'm not quoting myself. I said, okay. Probably said, what? Something wrong? And she said, well, I'm working at McDonald's. She worked at McDonald's over in, where? Brainerd, which is on the other side, one of the mountains. And said, my ride left early. I said, well, okay, I'll be there to pick you up. So, like an idiot, well, not like, I go at the back door of the dorm. Because my car is parked back there, so I went out the back door. Okay, and I found out it was actually propped open, so evidently people went back and forth on a regular basis after hours. I didn't know that. Okay, so I went out, okay, and so I go pick her up. She was in a house dorm, took her to the dorm. That's all. I got her, took her to the dorm, came right back to the dorm, and I walk in the front door, maybe that was about what I should have done, and I signed back in. And that happened 3 times in a week. Now, most of you would have no idea what this means, okay? When I say demerit counsel, you have no idea what I'm talking about, okay? Anybody know what I'm talking about? Some of you do. Okay, some of you people have been real strange, some of the old strange people, okay? Okay, all right. So we're at demerit counsel that met every Thursday, I think it was. And so you went out, if your name was on the list, then you had to, so you got on this long line of this condemned prisoners were there, and they were all, commiserating about how terrible we are. And you walked inside, and it's true, you were there, and everybody on the council was raised. It was like, like smoke to go up or whatever. And so I explained what happened. And so I left, and I said, well, okay, we'll see what happens. Well, a few days later, I checked. I had 45 demerits. 100 you kicked out, and you get demerits for a messy room. So I knew I wouldn't make it the year. I would be out by the end of the year because I always had a messy room, okay? And so I went to the guy in charge. I said, Dr. Robinson, I said, I'm just a first-year student. I'm here to learn God's word and God's will, and obviously what I did was wrong. So she called me. She had no way to get home. We had no money. She couldn't buy it. Well, what should I have done? Well, okay. Well, he didn't think of that. He took all the demerits off, okay? So he took all the demerits off because it was a weird situation, okay? And all I'm saying to you is this. I could have cocked an attitude, and there are many freshman Bible college students that cocked attitudes about the rules. when I went off to school, there was a big, rule book, all these different rules. You could be together this time, not at that time. And it was just a lot of rules. Okay, so be as it may, the attitude of how I responded to the authority really made a significant difference. Now, I want to encourage you to be thought. Now, the challenge we face is, you say, well, when it comes to politics, all bets are off. I just want to give us all a word of caution, okay? I don't know that you can actually say that. Not all rules are off. Should we not still talk as Christians when we're talking about politics? I won't charge you for that one. That'll be free, okay? Let me get the last one very quickly and we'll be done, okay? The last one is to be honest. Let's go back to our text, okay? Back to our text and we'll land the plane, okay? Titus chapter 2. The last phrase says this in verse 10, not prolonging but showing all good fidelity, okay? The idea of prolonging is to not stealing, okay? Not stealing. And the idea of good fidelity is the idea of doing what's expected, all right? So the idea of being honest is in two ways. First of all, in possessions, and second of all, in performance. In other words, when I go to work, there should be no question that I'm not going to be stealing things. I'm not going to be taking things I shouldn't be taking. And if your company gives you benefits, so you can take a cup of coffee home and that's fine or whatever. Every company has their own stuff, okay? But you can't be taking a computer, unhooking the TV, take it home. I mean, there's a limit. So we as Christians need to be honest in our possessions, okay? The money we're entrusted with, but also in our performance. Okay? Now, all these are to guide us from these two verses to help us to do what? To get a raise? Well, if you get a raise, you get a raise. But not really to get a raise, but to be right. And if our daily obligations, our work ethic, and remember, our work ethic begins from the moment we get up in the morning to the moment we go to bed at night. It applies at home, it applies in the church, it applies in the workplace. So take these principles. If they can help you, encourage you, use them, and let God direct you.